said I wasn't going to do. Is it working? Okay, good. Little sound check. So I'm Tim Essington. I'm faculty here at SAFS. I'm delighted to introduce today's Bevan speaker. This is week 8, Rupert Howes, who is the, what's your title? I already forgot it. Chief Executive something of the Marine Stewardship Council. It's right behind me. There, CEO of the Marine Stewardship Council. And I won't say more about the MSC because I assume you'll hear an awful lot about that program in Rupert's talk. So I'm just going to give a real brief intro, a little bit tell you about Rupert's history. He comes more of sort of the economics, business sort of accounting background, and I think you'll sort of see that come through in his presentation. Before he was at Marine Stewardship Council, he was the director of the Forum Sustainability Economy Program, and then several other senior research fellows at sort of similar themed institutes. And he's been the chief executive of the MSC since October 2004, and a whole bunch of awards. I can't say all of them, but they include the Skoll Award. So it turns out Skoll is just not something that Swedes say before they're drinking, but it's actually an award. There's the Schwab Foundation's Social Entrepreneurship Award, and there is the World Wildlife Foundation Leaders for a Living Planet Award in 2009. So all sorts of accolades for the work that Rupert's done to advance eco-labeling as a way to achieve ecological goals. And I only know Rupert just a little bit from being on the technical advisory board, but I think anyone who's met him today will notice sort of 3 things. A lot of energy, even though he's jet-lagged, a lot of enthusiasm for what he does, and very strong conviction in the tools that that he's promoting to achieve change. So really excited to hear his presentation. So please join me in welcoming Rupert.
All right. Thank you, Tim, Daniel, for the invitation. I am really pleased to be here. I have to say, my 10 years at MSC, this is the first time ever I've been invited to give a talk, but to give 6 hours of discussion before the talk, and then give the talk at 12:30 at night, my time. So if I drift off, and for many of you who came to those back-to-back half-hour sessions this afternoon, I often go off at a tangent. Just remind me, bring me back to the point, because I do tend to talk for England. But literally. What I want to do, as I put in the abstract, is I want to give you an overview of 15 years of experience at the Marine Stewardship Council and how we're using what we view as a credible third-party certification and labeling program to reward and incentivize sustainable fishing. I want to draw on the evidence base, the growing evidence base, that there is an ecological case for what we do, and also a growing business case that leaders in the conservation community and the industry really are driving real and lasting change. I'm not focusing on the standard and the technical side, but I'm happy to take some questions on that. I gather Dr. David Agnew gave a presentation about a year ago. David leads our standards team and the technical oversight, and led the fishery standards review that's recently concluded. But I'm blessed by having a lot of my US team in the audience tonight, including fisheries experts, that I'll be deferring all the tricky, difficult questions to. So team, could you, Jeff Boland is our program director for the USA. Jim Humphreys works on global fisheries coordination. Dan Averill leads our fisheries outreach in West Coast Canada and the USA. Who else we got here? Melissa deals with communications, and we have one of our interns here as well. And we're always looking for interns, so if anybody is interested in doing a stint in our Seattle office, please talk to Jeff. This picture, just to kick off, I live on the south coast of the UK. I like living by the sea, so although I work in London, I live in Brighton, which is about 50 miles south of London. And this fishmonger is a 3rd-generation fishmonger in Hastings, which is just up the road. It's actually an area of high social deprivation in the UK, despite being in the southeast. 3rd-generation fishmonger, MSC Chain of Custody certified. There's Dover sole, herring and mackerel fisheries, small-scale inshore community fisheries that have achieved MSC certification. And it's just a wonderful story. This is going back to the times of William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings. These guys have been fishing since then. In fact, the leader of the fishing industry group that sought that certification traces his ancestry back to the Norman invasion. And I show this picture, one, because it's one of my nearest MSC certified fishmongers, even if it's a little bit up the coast. But two, all too often people talk about MSC as big fisheries, industrial fisheries, Walmart, McDonald's. But the point is we're a global program and we operate at all scales, including independent fishmongers. If the technology works, and partly to give me a breather, I wanted to show a very quick film. The reason why I wanted to show that is, it personifies what this is all about. It's about people, oceans, and food. And pretty much every one of those fisheries sort of showcased in that very short film is involved in the MSC program one way or the other. And again, you saw developing world fisheries, large-scale, small-scale fisheries, not all of them certified. Hopefully I can get back to my slides. I'm also acutely aware that this is a super informed audience, and I'm straying into, oh, where's it gone? There we are, sorry, thanks. You guys are going to be much more better informed than me, but why does MSC exist? We know there's a huge, massive need for food, a planet that's going from 7 billion to 9 billion people. I've seen different statistics on this. People talk about seafood being the main source of protein for 1 billion people on the planet. I think the FAO talk about seafood meeting 18% of human animal protein needs. It is super important, as the work that Ray Hilborn is doing here demonstrates that seafood is also a very low carbon intensity source of protein. If we mine it out, the sort of wider environmental impacts from terrestrial farming systems will be much greater. Also, again, lots of different statistics on this, and I think, you'll all be aware of this, but it's the global seafood industry in all of its forms, whether it's direct fishing, support industries, supports a huge number of livelihoods. I saw one figure talking about 10% of livelihoods. That seemed very huge, but I guess that's bringing in all the sort of subsistence, small-scale developing world fisheries as well. A jumble of slides provided for me by Nico Galtieres, one of the students from University of Washington. But again, you're all very familiar with this. It's a bit of a cliche, but we do have too many boats chasing too few fish. Catch per unit of effort is going down. And also, sadly, the trends, despite huge improvements, particularly in the assessed stocks, are also moving in the wrong direction. Overfished stocks about 30%. Fully exploited, nothing wrong with that, but they're about half of the stocks. All at a time that the demand for seafood is going up. As the emergence of middle classes in India, China, and elsewhere, we all know with more money, we want to consume more seafood. And as this slide demonstrates, the proportion of underexploited has decreased and the proportion of overexploited has increased. So I think there is an ecological or a sustainability imperative that we ensure global oceans are fished on a sustainable basis. Also, this slide, I've cobbled this together from various presentations that people in the team put together. It's a very European flavour, but seafood sustainability and ocean sustainability is getting on the agenda. It really is becoming an end consumer interest. People are informed, and I think increasingly people are asking questions about where their seafood comes from. Is it from a sustainable fishery? Is it traceable? Is it contributing to overfishing or not? And particularly in my part of the world, in the UK, maritime nation, we've seen the complete collapse of our fishing industry compared to where it used to be in terms of capacity and numbers employed, and a huge amount of coverage almost every week in the broadsheet papers on the state of fish stocks and what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. And not surprisingly, the markets are becoming sensitized. Seafood is the most traded primary commodity in the world, half of that coming from the developing world. And retailers around the world recognize that this is a business risk issue. The advocacy groups are raising awareness, Greenpeace, WWF, and others. Retailers are worried, and they want to manage that business risk. They also want to give their consumers assurance that they're doing the right thing. And they're looking for a range of mechanisms to provide that assurance. And one of them, obviously, is the Marine Stewardship Council. And backtracking a little bit, I think this is a very informed audience. Hands up who's heard of the Marine Stewardship Council before becoming aware of this lecture? So that's pretty much everybody. Who actually finds MSC labeled products when you go shopping? Okay, a smaller number, but I assume most of you had actually seen the eco label out there somewhere. Okay. Well, the history is MSC was founded in 1997. The sort of catalyst for MSC being founded by Unilever, at the time the biggest purchaser of frozen white fish, owning brands like Birdseye, Igloo, Gorton's in the States was owned by Birdseye Igloo, and WWF coming together, was the collapse of the Grand Banks cod fishery. So that was very much the wake-up call for the industry. Unilever, they needed plentiful supplies of frozen white fish, otherwise they'd have no business, no Captain Birdseye, no profits. And I think for WWF, there was a frustration at their ongoing sort of public policy advocacy work, not really delivering changes in the water, so to speak. So both organizations came together. The Forest Stewardship Council had been set up 4 or 5 years before, so MSC was very much modeled on the Forest Stewardship Council. But the idea was to create an organization that would use the market, that would help with its partners create the incentives that would reward existing good fisheries management, of which there is a lot, but critically, and this is where the theory of change comes in, incentivize those fisheries that needed to be improved to make those improvements because of market benefits. So that's the theory of change. The mission is to use our third-party, evidence-based, science-based certification and labeling program to recognize well-managed and sustainable fisheries, and through the use of the eco-label in the marketplace, to empower all of us as individuals, as consumers, to make a good environmental choice that ultimately sends those benefits back down the supply chain to those fisheries that are operating sustainably. And it's important to say this from the outside, there is no silver bullet to the global problem of overfishing and the myriad of challenges, acidification, climate change facing our oceans. It isn't about market-based programs or public policy. We need every tool in the toolbox if we're going to shift our entire economic systems onto a more sustainable footing. So we need public policy advocacy from the pressure groups. We need leadership from government and regulators to reform policies where needed. And then I think market-based programs can actually be a complement to the delivery of public policy objectives of sustainable fisheries. So 15 years on, I'm sort of fast forwarding, where have we got to? So on the supply side, we have about 10 million, it's a little bit out of date, 10 million metric tons of seafood. About 10% of annual global landings are now either certified or under assessment. And as you can see, the growth has been pretty significant, and I think most of the MSC's global team would agree. It's an exhausting place to work because we have grown very, very rapidly, and there's been a lot of change in terms of structures, growth in offices, but also in terms of the standard and its development and evolution since we were launched in 1999. I turned off the sort of animation on this, but essentially I wanted to show this slide again to demonstrate that whilst when we started, when I joined in 2004, there were only 6 fisheries, and we didn't have any engagement from the developing world. It was mainly concentrated in Alaska and Pacific Northwest and some European fisheries. But now, we have engagement in Latin America, Africa, Asia. I think 60% of US fisheries by landings are actually engaged in the program. A similar amount of Canadian fisheries are engaged. Norway, 70%. So in Iceland, actually, it's pretty much most of the fisheries, I think, are now either certified or under assessment. Is that right, Jim? Yeah. I'm being recorded. I better watch what I'm saying. So fisheries in 34 countries, about 10% of global landings. And as I said, it isn't restricted to large-scale industrial fisheries. Whilst there's a relatively small number of developing world fisheries, they are beginning to engage. And when I get towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk about the future and how we want to more effectively and strategically engage with developing world small-scale data poor fisheries, either directly or in partnership with others. So MSC is trying to operationalize a model of sustainable production by encouraging global fisheries to meet a rigorous science-based standard for ecological sustainability. But on the other side of the same coin, we also want to operationalize a model of sustainable consumption by empowering initially major seafood buyers, the people that decide what goes in the cabinet, but ultimately, as I said, all of us as consumers to make informed choices when we're buying seafood. And so on the market side, again, from a very low base, there's been rapid growth. I think one of the catalysts for this rapid growth was the certification of Alaskan pollock, because in the early years, we really suffered from no supply, no market, no market, no supply. But when Alaska pollock got certified, I think it gave a lot of the European processors and retailers confidence that instead of having the humble Thames herring or the Australian rock lobster making up 0.001% of their offering, they suddenly had sufficient fish that they could actually begin to put the label on and explain to their consumers that we care about sourcing and we're beginning to source MSC labeled products. Game changers as well, and they attracted the headlines. Walmart in 2006 made a commitment to source all of their wild caught seafood from MSC certified fisheries. And more recently, initially in Europe, McDonald's went for 100% MSC certification and use of label. And that covers everywhere from Russia all the way through to Northern Europe and Southern Europe. 2 years later, the United States followed suit, and I think in the US there's 21,000 McDonald's restaurants. Canada then followed, and then Brazil. So it's a great illustration of MSC's theory of change. In Europe, in the United States, I think all of the fishes from the Alaska pollock fishery. In Europe, they were sourcing hoki, hake, Eastern Baltic cod, Barents Sea cod. And McDonald's have been working with Conservation International, developing a procurement policy. They had a sort of traffic light system. They were beginning to move towards wanting to source MSC certified fish. And they told their supply chain, this is the direction of travel we want to go. We'd like you to get MSC certified. 4 of those 5 fisheries, supply fisheries, were certified. Eastern Baltic cod wasn't. They had problems of overfishing and some pirate fishing. There were some marine mammal interactions. And Eastern Baltic cod didn't go forward, and McDonald's stopped buying from them. And then Eastern Baltic cod went into MSC assessment. WWF worked with them. There was Esperson's, the supplier for McDonald's, had a big processing plant in Bornholm, an island in the Baltic. They said, look, we really need this fishery to be certified because there's thousands of jobs dependent upon it. And that sort of brokerage, using the MSC as a sort of mechanism, bringing parties together, led to improvements in that fishery. It achieved certification, and as soon as they did, McDonald's made their announcement and started using the label. So I think that's a great example of how a commitment can actually lead to change and improvement involving civil society, conservation organizations, simply using the MSC as a tool or a mechanism. Because ultimately, MSC is just a standard holder. The leadership comes from the industry, the fisheries that engage in the program, and our partners who engage in the third-party assessment process that really underpin the credibility. Again, it's taken a long time to get here, but we're now seeing really significant commitments from retailers. They've been sensitized to the issue as part of their corporate social responsibility. They want to make sure, whether it's reducing climate impact, resource use, water use, energy use, when it comes to seafood, they look for assurance, and MSC is increasingly seen as a credible way to provide the assurance, business risk management that they want. And it's become global. I'm going to whiz through some of these quite quickly, because what I'm very keen to do is actually get onto a discussion, and I should have said at the beginning, please interrupt if you want to with any questions or points of clarification. Kaufland in Germany, pretty much every German retailer has built MSC into their procurement policy, and it's the retailers and the suppliers that do all of this signage. We have very limited money. MSC actually remains an international not-for-profit, a 501c3. We don't have huge budgets to do advertising. But in Europe, European consumers, they trust first and foremost their immediate family, then their close source of friends, but then they have a huge degree of trust in credible third-party certification. You know, we have eco-labels for all sorts of things, and consumers are sensitized to that, and they expect to see it. In the States, I think there's more trust in government, perhaps, and less trust in NGOs, and that might explain why it's taken us a little bit longer to begin to get that sort of visible use of the label as widely spread as we have in Germany. Germany, half of all wild-caught seafood now carries the label. The reason why I showed this slide is Kaufland actually charged a premium, half a euro cent or 50 euro cents on a kilo of MSC labeled fish, specifically to raise money from the consumption end to pass back to the production end to subsidize developing world fishery, to make improvements, all with the aim of getting it through a fishery improvement partnership project, where it's working with the University of Rhode Island and others, and I think with some USAID funding, to ultimately get MSC certification. And I think there's a really exciting potential here of perhaps scaling that up to take money from the consumption end to fund generic improvements in fisheries that could help facilitate this sort of broader transition, globally. Again, it's taken us years to get to this point. It's really only been over the last few years that we are seeing MSC certified seafood promotions leading in spikes in sales, increased revenues, and sometimes price premiums. And interestingly, you know, when consumers, most parts of the world, except for maybe Japan, where they really will spend a long time making decisions on seafood, most consumers go in and it's nanoseconds between, is it chicken, pork, beef, or fish? They don't really mind, in Europe at least, whether it's farmed or wild. It's the decision's made like that. And that's what we're trying to do with the MSC Eco label. It's like a very quick second. It's that blue tick. You don't have to worry about it. There's third-party assurance, a global trust mark that this seafood is a sustainable product. But interestingly, when we've done co-marketing and work at the retail end, these promotions raise the whole seafood category. So it's actually benefiting fish over chicken or pork, which I think is an added benefit to the seafood industry. I'll go through these relatively quickly. I wanted to show this slide because, again, it sort of touches on the theory of change. Lidl and Aldi, major retailers in Germany, they are the heavy discounters. These stores, the format is the same in every store. They have about 1,000 products. It is spit and sawdust compared to Tesco's, one of the biggest retailers in the world. They have up to 40,000 products. Very different shopping experience. Walmart was out-competed in the German market and left the German market because these guys are really, really good at, you know, squeezing margins and selling things cheaply. But despite that business model, they have 3 different price points here for pretty much the same product. So on the left, non-MSC labeled fish. That was at the time Russian pollock. You then had a little private label MSC certified fish at a premium. And then you had the Bird's Eye Igloo branded product at an even higher price. Now, the packaging was virtually identical. The only difference on the little, private label products was the MSC label. Covered actually a huge part of the front of pack. Now, over the years, as mainly driven in Northern Europe, as processors and retailers said, we want this third-party assurance. The Russian pollock industry felt that they were losing market share, and they came into the assessment process. And again, I think this is a good thing. It opened the fishery up to a third-party assessment process. MSC depends on all the evidence used to score the fishery to be publicly available. The stock assessment in Russia previously wasn't publicly available, and through the MSC process, it's become available. And that Russian fishery is now certified. And I have no doubt one of the motivating factors was the demand pool of a price point differential at some of the most important markets. Carrefour, world's biggest retailer. Walmart is the world's biggest retailer. Sorry, Carrefour is the world's biggest food retailer. Les Yeux Bleus, this is a co-promotion with competing brands, all working together, and again, lifting MSC sales, and they do this annually now. Our various teams, MSC is now about 150 people operating from 15 offices around the world. A lot of our local teams work, they do fisheries outreach, engaging with fisheries, but they also do commercial outreach. We do sort of fun things like this that sort of promote and educate at the same time, and these are kids learning about the challenges of mixed fisheries, and first time in they scoop in everything, and then they've got to be a little bit more discretionary in what they're doing. But it's a great way to sort of raise awareness of MSC and build support. Let's go through these quite quickly. This is perhaps one of the most amazing initiatives. In Denmark is actually a small country, but very important in terms of fish exports. And the Danish Fishermen's Producer Organisation has committed 100% to get all of their fisheries MSC certified over a period of time. And then the Danish retailers have pretty much made a similar commitment that they want to stock and supply MSC certified seafood. And then we had the three largest retailers, as it says there, 2,400 stores, 90% of the market, coming together to promote MSC labeled products at the same time. So again, this to me says this is going beyond the early days where an individual brand or a supermarket would use MSC to differentiate from its competitors, to a point that competitors come together with the seafood industry to say, this is beyond competition. This is about sustainability and ensuring we have plentiful supplies of seafood into the future. And they work together. And in fact, I think it was the Danish Fishermen's Organisation that paid for these really amazing artwork posters that went up all over Copenhagen during this campaign. And again, it's quite remarkable. MSC doesn't view itself as a brand. We view ourselves as a standard setter with a global trust mark. We don't do huge promotions of the MSC logo, but again, here in Denmark, the retailers have done it for us. And it's not surprising that in countries like Germany, 50% of consumers are aware of the MSC label. It's quite remarkable for an organisation that doesn't actually do much sort of direct marketing. When we started, we were a very small organisation. We've grown over time, but some of the criticisms of the MSC program were, you're all about industrial fisheries, you're only working in North America and Europe. We have a business plan that I'm going to come on to discuss, but part of our strategy is to engage more effectively in the developing world, but also to engage more effectively in the major producers and consumers countries. So we have an office in Tokyo where we're working with the seafood industry and the market there. Spain, relatively recently, we opened an office in Madrid. We have 2 or 3 people there. And we found that generally, when you have people in country who speak the right language, are on the right time zone, raising awareness of the program benefits, things happen. And here, Eroski, one of the biggest Spanish supermarkets, working with us on a co-promotion of a Norwegian skrei cod product. And it's great. It's co-labeling. It's got Norg. They're the sort of equivalent of ASME in Norway. So you've got their sort of logo representing the pristine waters of Norway, underpinned by a global trust mark of the MSC, and resulted in higher sales. Aeon, Japan's largest retailer. Again, fascinating. They came to us and said, we Japanese consumers are very sophisticated. We have a lot of QR codes on a lot of our products. People ask where things come from. They've never heard of MSC, but we want to get 10% of our seafood from MSC certified fisheries and use the label because we want a credible program. And despite the complete lack of knowledge with Japanese consumers, they're doing that. And again, actually, it's benefiting Alaskan products. Our Japan team are working with our American team, and we've seen active promotion of Alaskan fisheries in Aeon, who are very, very keen to do more of the same. My country, Sainsbury's, so this artwork, actually, we've got £500,000 of pro bono work from Saatchi and Saatchi, and they did all of this fancy sort of imagery, but the whole idea is it's about abundance and oceans, and we can eat seafood. Because MSC is very, pro-fishing industry, pro-eating fish. We just want to make sure it's from well-managed and sustainable stocks. And it was just amazing to see that van driving by, because this stuff happens organically without our involvement. And the reason why I showed this slide is, this is quite remarkable, because MSC is beginning to appear in advertising and even in TV commercials as a logo that sort of just flashes across the screen in a nanosecond. But this is the first example I've seen of a retailer actually calling out other retailers and saying, look, we're committed to sustainable seafood sourcing. This is where we are. Where are you, the competition? And that's groundbreaking. I mean, this was in the Times, the Guardian, the Independent. And Sainsbury's are the leading UK retailer in terms of products. I show this slide because in reality, MSC was sort of a marketing, consumer-facing organisation without much marketing or consumer-facing expertise. And that became obvious when, it was only relatively recently we worked out that Marine Stewardship Council meant nothing to most people. Our logo, until relatively recently, was in English everywhere. So for a German consumer, Marine Stewardship Council, what was that, military? Japan, they thought it was government. And then we suddenly came up with this idea of, why don't we let each country come up with words equivalent to certified sustainable seafood in their own language? And I think that's undoubtedly helped us in terms of end consumer recognition. So this was just a collection of, the growing number of different languages. It's quite challenging sometimes because certified sustainable seafood is hard to translate in Chinese or Japanese or Polish. I've talked about fishery engagement, numbers and tons of fish. I've talked about the market engagement. And in fact, actually, one thing I didn't say is that the global market now for labelled sales is about just under $5 billion. It's grown and it's quite significant. That's important because that creates the critical mass and the engine that drives the program. The more the market demands sustainable seafood choices, the more fisheries come into the program, open themselves up to public scrutiny, and where necessary, make improvements. And that's ultimately the key metric that MSC should be judged by. Through the leadership of our partners using the MSC program, is change on the water being delivered, which is why we were set up all those years ago. And it's taken us time to get here, but we have a monitoring and evaluation team. In fact, Nico is the lead on that. And we are committed every year to report metrics on the ecological case and indeed the business case where we can get hold of the facts and figures to talk about what fisheries are doing and what changes are happening. And really, this is what it's about. The last report talked about, you can read the slide, several hundred improvements. We have fisheries moving forward, having voluntary closures, doing more research, occasionally modifying gear, making radical changes, reducing bycatch as part of their certification process. And I think this slide is from Nico, actually. I'm really veering into territory I know nothing about, and all of you will recognize these plots. But as one of Nico's bits of research was basically saying, a comparison of certified to non-certified assessed stocks indicates, on the whole, that MSC stocks are healthier, fishing mortality is lower, and as we see, fisheries are migrating to that bottom right-hand side where, B is above BMSY and F is below FMSY. But I'm going to move swiftly on from that one. Help. And I'm going to talk about the South African hake fishery as really, I think this fishery personifies what the MSC is about. When I joined MSC, I was very aware that to build the trust and confidence of the NGO community, we needed to demonstrate the impact of the program. And just before Christmas, the South African hake fishery issued a press release. And they had talked about the economic and the ecological case. 2 independent economic studies were commissioned that demonstrated without MSC certification, the net present value of the fishery would be 35% below what it was today. And also 12,000 jobs would be at risk directly in the industry and the processing industry. Through MSC certification, when the fishery first came in 2004, the stock's previously been managed as a single stock, but through the MSC process, they actually identified there were 2 hake stocks, and one of them was overfished. So there was conditions on the fishery to rebuild that stock. And they also discovered that there were 10,000 birds or so being killed every year, and a high number of wandering albatross. And so over a period of time, using the MSC as the mechanism, the industry built relationships with WWF South Africa. They strengthened the relationships with the government and the regulator. They rebuilt the stocks, so all the stocks now are at or above BMSY. And amazingly, they reduced the bycatch of birds by 90% and wandering albatross mortality by 99%. So that, to me, that single press release, not from MSC, but from the industry saying, this is what we've done, and we are really proud to do this. Plus, sorry, I forgot to say, they've expanded their export markets off the back of MSC, and they now total about $187 million annually. We have an example of a developing world fishery, safeguarding jobs, reducing environmental impacts, and now catalyzing interest from neighbours in Namibia with their hake fishery, and that's the way the program works. So I've covered most of that. I better move on a bit quickly. As I said, we're getting better at tracking this. Bentry Vietnamese clam fishery, price improvements, new markets, and direct income for the fishers, a 400% increase, partly because they started selling the clams, in their shells. So there was significant, added value there. Baja California lobster fishery, one of the first fisheries into the program, and people involved in that industry think that the MSC certification, that global recognition as a well-managed fishery, actually encouraged the government to invest in their communities. They got new roads, they got electricity, things that they hadn't had, and people in Baja think the MSC program was helpful in that area. Suriname sea bob. I mean, there's a myriad of these examples now that are listed on our website, where MSC is simply a mechanism, a tool that showcases what might need to happen and can create the space to bring industry, scientists, regulators, governments together to fix things if they need fixing, because the market is actually prepared to give preference, on occasion a price premium, and access. This is one of my favorites, the Maldivian skipjack pole and line tuna fishery. Again, a difficult assessment. There were challenges with data. WWF actually raised an objection to this fishery. The action plan was strengthened, and they got their certification. I think it accounts for 12% of employment in the Maldives and 6% of GDP. Hugely important, but through their certification, they're winning increased access to European markets and some price premiums. And I have to say, the Maldivians have become one of the biggest advocates for public policy reform in the Indian Ocean in terms of implementation of harvest control rules, which again, I think takes the benefits of the MSC program beyond the individual units of certification of the fisheries. Gambian sole fishery improvement partnership, talked about Kaufland sending them some money. So moving rapidly on, 15 years. We've learnt by doing. Many of you will be very aware of the difficult gestation and birth the MSC had, the ups and downs, some of the controversies. But we're very clear in what we do. We've improved the standard. We've built certified capacity. We've got better at doing what we do and tracking those metrics. And therefore, I think the ecological case and the business case have been proven. Critical, I think, to that success is governance. And I report to an international board of trustees. It's a voluntary board. We have hardwired into our governance that we have 2 members of the board from the fishing industry. Till recently, we had John Connolly, head of the NFI in the United States, Jeff Davis from American Seafoods. And board members rotate there. We have fixed terms, and they can only be on the board for 6 years. We have 2 from the NGO sector. We have 2 from the market sector. Those 6 seats are designated. We want our constituent stakeholders on our board to help form the strategic direction of the organisation. But I hasten to say those board members are there not to fight the corner of the industry or the NGOs, but to offer their wisdom and their knowledge of their sectors to make the MSC work better. The majority of the board are made up of independents, scientists and academics. We recently went through a governance review and actually expanded the board, bringing in 4 independents, including Monique Babu, who is head of the GEF, a guy called David Muruthi, who is running Unilever's operations in West Africa. We didn't bring him in from a Unilever perspective, and in fact, he's moved on to run an energy company now in East Africa. We brought him on because he's got knowledge of Africa and fast-moving consumer goods markets, which I think is the next potential growth area for MSC, and various others. So the board is very important. We have a stakeholder council made up again of 40 individuals from around the world from those constituent stakeholders. They advise the board on key strategic issues, and we touched on that in some of the discussions this afternoon. Should MSC expand the scope to include aquaculture? Yes, no, maybe. Let's look at it again, and let's look at it again. Issues to do with developing world. Should MSC develop an in-transition mechanism? These things are the sorts of things that are debated obviously by the board, but informed by the stakeholder council. And Tim sits on our technical advisory board, where we have fishery experts, scientists, to help with the technical development of the standard, both standards, the chain of custody and the fisheries standard. That governance takes a lot of time, but it gives the retailers confidence that MSC is indeed a credible organisation, that we have no ability to influence the outcome of the independent certification process. There is a whole host of checks and balances to ensure the programme is credible and robust, but also that we follow the board's policy on changing the standard, which requires new science, and for that science to be widely accepted and used by management agencies before we think about changing the MSC standard. And also on the standard, we've just been through a 2-year process to review the standard. That's just been issued, and we will now leave it because everybody needs a bit of stability for at least 5 years. I mentioned chain of custody. As we know, fraud is quite prevalent in the seafood industry, whether it's species, weight, country of origin, mixing up farmed salmon with wild salmon. So the MSC program requires, if anybody uses the label in the marketplace, that the entire supply chain has an annual chain of custody audit, so we can track that fish from the restaurant or from the retailer all the way back down to the fishery where it came from. And it can take some time. South Georgia toothfish, I mentioned, was one of the controversial fisheries when I joined. That fishery was certified. Actually caused a lot of consternation with some of the US conservation organizations. And actually it illustrates some of the tensions between programs that maybe have a ratings for a species and an MSC program that actually says each fishery is unique. And we rely on the independent assessment process to look at the evidence to determine whether or not it's sustainable. So in the case of South Georgia, DNA testing was done that indicated it was semi-discrete population. Boats were banned from having transshipment. They had to be inspected before they left the port. They were required to defrost the bait before the lines were set. They had transponders on board. They had to come back, download the fish and make sure everything balanced. And because of that, whether that was the motivation for them to seek MSC certification is irrelevant. The point is they improved their level of performance and achieved MSC certification as a fishery. Now that caused huge problems, I have to say, with some NGOs saying, no, you shouldn't be buying from this species. But the point was that fishery had met the MSC standard and was subject to annual surveillance audits. I mention it, though, because it took the certifier 2 years to assure the chain of custody because of the high levels of pirate fishing and toothfish fisheries. Forward now 10 years, and I think we have about 60-70% of toothfish fisheries in the program. Why? Because they've seen the market advantage for South Georgia, getting price premiums and access back into the American market, into Whole Foods. It's a way of catalyzing change and improvement. Joyce is just talking about chain of custody and just really illustrating that seafood is really the most traded primary commodity, and those supply chains are quite complex. We use some of the income we generate to check the robustness of that supply chain. We do random product tracebacks all the way through the supply chain, and we do DNA testing. No system is foolproof. Sometimes errors are found, but on the whole, we get a 99% success rate that what is in that labeled, packaged, MSC certified product is indeed from that fishery. The current strategic plan, integrals. I'm not sure where this slide came from. 4 overarching strategic objectives. Our current strategic plan goes from 2012 to 2017. I show this because I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. I don't see these 4 overarching strategic objectives changing very much. Number one, we have to perpetually, continually look at the robustness and credibility of the program. If it's not deemed as credible, we will not generate the sort of demand pull and market support that brings more fisheries into the program. So David Agnew, who some of you met before, leads perhaps the biggest team in the MSC that's made up of technical oversight fisheries managers who review the independent assessments and give critical comment back to certifiers as stakeholders, as one of many stakeholders. We have a chain of custody team led by Chelsea Reinhardt, who's leading the development of improvements to the chain of custody. And we've had a speed and cost review looking at how we can take out cost and complexity but without reducing the robustness of the program. So this work is ongoing and I think will never go away. But also, unashamedly, we want to grow the demand for certified sustainable seafood choices because that is the engine that runs the MSC. And we want to go beyond Europe and North America. We've begun to expand in a typical, underfunded way. We have one woman in China, Anyan, in our Beijing office, beginning to engage with the Chinese market. We've had a team of 5 in Japan, and it's a tough environment to work, but they've been there for a number of years. We've recently opened a regional hub in Singapore with a few people. We have a couple of people in South Africa. But as we move into the next strategic planning period, I would like to engage more in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And obviously that's strategic objective number 3 is grow the supply base. But a challenge for MSC is that independent studies have indicated that perhaps only 10 or 15% of global fisheries as they're currently managed could achieve the standard. And we're already butting up on that threshold. Now, obviously, the hope is as the market demand grows, more fisheries will move up to that level of performance. But, you know, should MSC engage in the fishery improvement partnership space? Should we develop a tiered standard and in transition to MSC? As some people said, you know, putting the ladder down to the next tier of fisheries to encourage them to come into the MSC program. These are the sorts of things we're beginning to discuss. Strategic Objective 4 is really about making sure MSC is efficient and effective, that we use our hard-won charitable funding and the income we generate from logo use as effectively and efficiently as possible. So I've touched a little bit on the future. One thing that's a relatively recent development, the board has actually signed on onto a sort of partway through our strategic plan, you know, to engaging more with the developing world. So we're doing a little bit more outreach to governments. We're trying to provide non-direct technical assistance to some of the fishery partnerships, improvement partnerships that are underway. Dr. Yemi Orontui, who leads our Developing World program, has also been leading the development of new tools and methodologies to enable data-poor, small-scale developing world fisheries to access the program. And one recent innovation is our benchmarking and tracking tool. I've left a few brochures at the end on a table for those who might be interested. But our hope is that many of these FIPs will use an MSC pre-assessment to identify what the sustainability gap is in terms of their performance, and then use the benchmarking and tracking tool that pans down over our 28 indicators to assess their improvements through action plans towards ultimately getting to the point that they could enter MSC certification. So the benchmarking and tracking tool is there, but what's being debated now is should MSC formally develop an in-transition standard where there would be some sort of recognition for fisheries as they move towards MSC. So that's a hot topic. Aquaculture remains a hot topic. I wanted to conclude here, and I've spoken too long already because I wanted to have some questions and answers. I thought this was a spoof when this was sent to me, but it wasn't. This is a jolly, bald, happy Dutch astronaut in the International Space Station, Andre Coopers, and he put this on his web page or on his Facebook page. And I mean, you can read the text there, but my God, how much is that worth? Product placement in space. Unbelievable. Wild Alaskan salmon in a can and promoting its sustainable seafood. And the imagery is not too good, but there he is in the International Space Station looking out on a blue planet. And I like to end on that because I'm extremely optimistic about how I think it's possible to shift an entire economic sector onto a more sustainable footing. Europe, we've had huge public policy reform with the Common Fisheries Policy. We have a huge engagement now of European fisheries. As I said, Alaska and the Pacific Northwest has always been a leader. We have a lot of engagement with fisheries here. And I think the potential is to use a market-based program to sort of carry on with this transition. So I will leave it there because I'm mindful of overrunning and look forward to questions. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. So
people like choice, companies like choices. For seafood certification, MSC is a pervasive global choice. But is there room, in your view, for other organizations to provide such certification? And if so, to what extent should metrics and protocol be standardized?
It's a great question. Absolutely, we welcome competition. I think competition is a good thing, and ultimately, you know, my job is to make sure MSC remains credible, robust, and as cost efficient as possible, and then ultimately the market will decide what level of assurance it wants. It might choose MSC, it might choose another certification labeling program, it might choose working with Monterey Bay or New England or whoever it is developing a buyer partnership. So yes, there's a huge challenge. We need credible programs, so that's the critical question. They have to be credible. Should they all be standardized? I think gradually we might move in that direction. I do think as we look at the sustainable seafood movement, there will be more collaboration. Who knows, maybe there'll be mergers and acquisitions along the way. But to your key point, yeah, we welcome it. there's a heap of criticism out there. So I mean, and I love responding to it. I think there's a danger of MSC being a victim of its own success. You know, we have grown. Yes, we have a high profile now. We don't want to be a monopoly. But in terms of your question about science and foxes in the hen house, I think the beauty of the MSC program is we have no influence on the decisions. You know, I mean, the founders, when they set up this structure of a third-party program, I think really did the right thing, and we've strengthened that over time. So when I joined, MSC accredited the independent certifiers. We now have a separate accreditation body, Accreditation Services International, based in Germany. They determine whether or not independent certifiers have the competency to apply the MSC standard, not us. Those independent certifiers pull together teams of 2 to 3 scientists to do the independent assessments. Stakeholders can comment on whether they like that assessment team, and we've had examples of civil society resulting in changes in assessment team members. The program requires a huge amount of evidence. They require the scores to be justified. They then require an independent bunch of scientists to peer review what the first bunch did, and then there's an independent objections process for any engaged stakeholder to say, we still don't like the outcome. That's, I mean, maybe I've gone off on the wrong tangent, but that to me builds in checks and balances to ensure that whatever's going on with MSC in terms of the market side is completely separate from the science and the evidence that determines whether a fishery is sustainable, certified. Yeah, and again, I'm probably not going to answer this properly or fully. We've just been through a 2-year standards review. And like all things in MSC, because we have this multi-stakeholder model, we often get polarized views from different stakeholders about what we should be doing and what direction we should be going in. And during the standards review, we had some parts of the seafood industry saying, we're going to walk away, you're raising the bar, it's going to get more complicated. And we had some parts of the conservation community saying, we need you to go further. You know, we want, you know, far greater scrutiny on this, that, or the other. But again, MSC can't influence this. We have a board policy that states we will adopt new science in the standard, as I said earlier, if it's widely adopted and accepted and in use by management agencies. You know, we don't want to be out there forcing change on regulators by being at the vanguard of new scientific understanding. We want to be sort of a little bit behind the crest of the wave in terms of encouraging best practices as it changes and periodically doing standards reviews. So again, maybe I'm not fully answering your question, but I see the two as completely separate. And I think the beauty of the MSC program is it has that integrity. Well, I'll pass over to Tim to answer from a technical advisory board perspective or anybody else. I hope that does for now, but I'm staying around for a beer, so I'm happy to discuss that one further.
Curious, I saw that ad from the UK store that said how many of your products are sustainable. Have you thought about the possibility of giving certification to retailers that have over a certain percent of the fish that they're moving being certified, which puts a damper on anybody, a direct damper on anybody who's selling uncertified fish?
We haven't. I mean, the retailer typically gets Chain of Custody certification if you know they have a wet fish or fresh fish case. But no, we haven't. And again, looking to the future, I've just started this discussion with the board about the next 5 years. These are the sorts of things we need to look at. In New Zealand, they've talked about, you know, could we do generic assessments, a P3 assessment on management regimes. And in fact, interestingly, we are beginning to move away from single fishery certifications. In the UK, we got British government funding to do a project called Project Inshore that looked at over 400 inshore, fisheries. Sadly, the bulk of those were deemed, not nearly ready to move into full certification. 11 were, and that model's been taken over to Australia, where the Western Australian government did due diligence. They looked at all sorts of schemes. They looked at other industry schemes, and they came back to MSC and said, "We think you're the most credible thing out there. We want to put all of our fisheries in Western Australia into the MSC program." And the beauty of this one was they said, and we're putting in $15 million to pay for the pre-assessments, and where they identify issues that need solving, we'll fix them. And that, again, was a fantastic thing of MSC simply being used as the mechanism to leverage government money to improve those fisheries. And so certification of retailers, maybe that's an idea, but I think MSC's grown now that maybe we can look at innovative ways of doing more with less and more quickly. So make a note of that and have a think what that might mean. Thank you. Lots of hands. Why don't we take this one first? I have to come back to Daniel in a minute, and then we'll take you. MSC is ambitious, you know. And optimistic. Well, we have a policy on shark fins, and actually it's diminishing. I think that. But what's the prospects? Well, we've just recently had Chinese fishery become certified. Chinese consumers are deeply concerned about supply chains and integrity of those supply chains. And actually that plays to MSC's advantage. We have MSC labeled product in Chinese supermarkets. But at the moment, the way it's structured is it has to be imported fish to carry the MSC label. We hope one day that Chinese fish, you know, domestic fisheries processed in China will also be able to carry the label. And that's one thing Anyan is working on. So Zhangzi Dao scallop fishery has become certified. We have labeled product there, but it's early days. I am actually actively recruiting 3 posts in China, which for us is massive. We're going to go from 1 person to 4 people, deal with 1 billion people in the country. But this is a project of decades. And so I'm interested in how we can learn from the last 15 years and accelerate progress. And I have no doubt, you know, MSC is not the panacea. As I said right at the beginning, we need public policy reform, we need advocacy. I don't know how replicable a model that depends on an eco-label is in certain markets. But we've got to try, and progress is being made quite quickly in China. And it's a sort of country that if the government decides, actually we're going to do this, it might move quite quickly. I had my first trip to China with the World Economic Forum to Tianjin about 6 months ago, and it was just amazing to see the development, the progress, and the interest in MSC. Daniel. Oh, was that the one over there? Oh, we allowed one more just because you had a... Okay.
So I guess my question is, does the success of MSC require that a bunch of fisheries are not certified so that, you know, the market will only support so much difference in price, and that as more of the non-certified fisheries get certified, the price difference in the market will support basically go away?
No. I'd tell you why. Because, you know, it's taken us 15 years to get 10% of global fisheries in the program, and not all of those are getting price premiums. You know, so there's a lot of, it's the beauty of the MSC program. We have Australian rock lobster tails that, you know, market at $30 for a pair, and we have huge volumes of whitefish that is sold with no premium. We were concerned actually that some of the early movers adopted MSC because they wanted to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, and there was a little bit of a concern that when all of their competitors were doing the same, would they drop it? But that's not been the case, because it almost becomes the benchmark that, you know, the consumers have become aware of the MSC label, and we've still got a long, long way to go. So, you know, whilst in Germany half all wild caught seafood carries the label because they eat salmon, pollock, and herring, and we've got all those, and mackerel, we've got all of those species certified. There's such growth potential in other markets. So who knows? But, you know, in 30 years, ask me the same, or my whoever comes next, the same question. But at the moment, we don't see that happening. Last question, I gather. Yeah.
So third-party certification requires a lot of data
Mm-hmm.
in order to assess them, and that data costs a lot of resources to get. So I'm just curious, what happens when a fishery wants to be certified but doesn't have the resources to do it? And what's sort of your vision for how those fisheries should be, like, what state should they be in if they don't have the money to do regular assessments or to get all of the data that somebody requires in order to assess them?
Yeah, I mean, MSC can't solve everything. So, you know, we're a voluntary program. We encourage fisheries to come forward and be assessed. We estimate maybe half of fisheries are not advised to progress to full assessment because of things that come up in the pre-assessment. And one of those issues is data. Various foundations are actually providing some funding to encourage small-scale community fisheries in. I think the odd stock assessment has been paid for where that's been an obstacle. But really, I don't know what the answer to that question is. Maybe if there is sufficient market pull, it might encourage the regulators to, fill some of the gaps that are needed on the data. Dan, Jim, have you got a thought on that one?
Well, we have a risk-based framework, which is part of our system protocol, where they don't meet certain that out. Partnerships with WWF, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and others who were seeking money for stock assessment for data collection.
And yeah, in the future, maybe we'll find other mechanisms. I mean, one of the things I'm very interested in is trying to unlock bilateral aid, development aid, to fund fishery improvements. And so for example, in Britain, we have a special relationship with Sierra Leone. One of the British DFID's, Department for International Development's concerns are livelihoods and food security. So to me, it seems pretty obvious that if we could get bigger projects using MSC to identify what the challenges are, a bit like the Western Australians are doing, but then use development aid to fund the capacity building, the data needs, it'd be very exciting. And it would link to livelihoods, food security, and all the things that they want to do, but with a credible program to provide the route map. Watch the next 10 years. I think we'll see some of that.
All right, perfect place to
Thank you. Thank you.